The 17th parallel divided North Vietnam from South Vietnam. Militarily speaking, South Vietnam was divided into 4 areas. The 4th Corps area in the south, the 3rd Corps in south-central Vietnam. Above that was the 2nd Corps, and in the north, the 1st Corps, or what was called the I Corps area. Each of these corps areas were vast. For example, the area within I Corps was approximately 10,000 square miles, with a beach line or coastline of 167 miles. To understand the war and to understand this program, the viewer must realize that Vietnam was not a small country with a few lush jungles, but a very old country with a rich history and varied types of terrain.
It's a region of the world that has been in conflict for really as long as there's been recorded history, and perhaps beyond that. The indigenous people fighting the Chinese and the Vietnamese coming down into the area. The Vietnamese are actually people that move into this region 400 or 500 years before the Europeans, and they push the people that lived in this area back up into the highlands and into the jungles, the Montagnards, the Hmongs. Indigenous people are moved out by the Vietnamese. In turn, the French come in and occupy this area as a colonial area, as part of the imperialist era. The people are in uprising against the French over and over again, and that'll result in the French open warfare with the Vietnamese for a few years, and that'll culminate in 52 or 53 in there with some bad French defeats and Dien Bien Phu and the debacle and all that. And so there you have the peace arrangement in 54 that divides the country, provides for elections down the road, and the communist state in the north and the supposedly democratic state in the south. The elections are held, the results are just thrown out basically because the north won, it was more populous. And you'll find them at that point, U.S. advisors, beginning as the French withdraw, U.S. advisors will be coming in and replacing the French advisors on the ground as we try and build an army, a defense force for this South Vietnamese government. As attacks occur against American advisors, then you're going to see eventually the president ordering American combat troops, ground combat troops into South Vietnam, initially to protect and then to conduct offensive operations to protect these advisor groups. It's ostensibly the reason they first go in there.
This is the story of how the infantry and armored forces first came to this foreign landscape to fight a most unconventional war. As a way to follow this incredibly complex story, let's look at the exploits of just some of the many American units deployed to fight this war. In the summer of 1966, more than 3,000 men of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division arrived on the coast of South Vietnam. They were there to continue the American buildup that had begun in earnest in 1965. As the advance contingent stepped ashore, they were welcomed by the Vietnamese and by their commander, General William C. Westmoreland. They then boarded buses to the airstrip for the last leg of the journey to their base camp near Pleiku, within the 2 Corps area, which was located between the Cambodian border to the west and the South China Sea, an area most often referred to as the Central Highlands. The 1st Cavalry was already established in a narrow corridor at An Key, but seasoned North Vietnamese Army units in regimental size controlled the vast bulk of the area. In the Central Highlands, difficult terrain made up of jungle, mountains, and waterways comprised most of the area. Also, it had the highest incidence of malaria in all of Vietnam. The rainy season was just beginning and operations were severely hampered. But neither the weather nor the harassing enemy could deter the infantry, who were determined to make the area their own. The engineers arrived with the division's advance party and quickly began to carve out an encampment at the base of Dragon Mountain, what would soon become a city in the jungle. With security details always on alert against sudden attack, the men of the 4th cleared the area and established their quarters. Mortar-proof bunkers and fortifications were built. Metal runways were set down for aircraft landing strips. Roads were slashed through the jungle to keep convoys running and troops on the move. Within little more than a year, the infantry base camp contained more than 900 buildings. The harsh countryside was peopled mostly by nomadic tribes who slashed and burned clearings in the forest, farmed it for a time, then moved on. Harassed and terrorized by the Viet Cong, these simple folk fell victim to a time and circumstance they could not fathom.
The Montagnard tribesmen were quite a superstitious lot, and there's a story about where personal safety overcame their superstitions. We were on a return back to camp from a 10-day operation. We'd been out about 8 days. This was in the last part of February 1968. And we were moving up this river valley. We weren't actually by the river. We were inland from a little bit in the flat bottom land where there's a lot of small trees. The jungle really hadn't or the forest hadn't really taken over, so there was quite a bit of space between the trees. Not a lot of underbrush, but there was some. And our point element, we were going down this nice trail, and our point element had found signs that a body of people, a number of people, supposedly the enemy, had used the trail and then gone off through the woods to the left. So our point element went in there several hundred yards and found a brand new bunker complex of 35 bunkers, which could hold about 3 men each. And they were built in a circle around this small open area. So I brought the whole company in. There was about 100 men. I brought the company in, and I placed them in the bunkers because I wanted to wait there for a while and check out the area, plus call in the location of the bunker complex back to our base camp. In the center of this circle was where the remains of a fire, and by playing with the embers and with the ashes, the fire was still warm, so whoever had been there building these bunkers had just left recently. Also, off to the side a few meters was a fresh grave, and instead of a headstone or a cross was a bamboo-shaped star. So we wanted to find out what was in the grave. Many times the graves we found were fake. I guess they thought that good Americans wouldn't dig up a grave, but you'd been there for a while, you didn't pay attention to that because graves were a good place to cache arms and ammunition. Even if there was a body in the grave, we wanted to find out who it was, what nationality, how they had died. Was it from wounds or sickness or whatever? Plus, the NVA and VC, especially the VC, had the habit of cacheing arms and ammunition underneath the bodies, further down in the grave. So we're going to stay there for a while and dig up the grave and look around for any other signs of activity. I had the two radio operators, two Montagnards, the two radio operators for myself and the other American, to go ahead and start digging up the grave. And I was on the radio a few feet away, calling back to the base camp, giving our exact location. They dug down, and they uncovered what looked like a body wrapped in a green tarp or a green poncho like the North Vietnamese carried. Well, as soon as they uncovered it, the other American on the team, who was a medic, went over and took out his knife, and he cut open the poncho and there was a body inside of it. Well, as soon as the body was exposed, the two Montagnards jumped out of the grave immediately because they're very suspicious, didn't like to be touching the dead. So my friend called me over to help him pull the body up out of the grave so we could unwrap it and see what had caused the death of the person that was in there. Well, I was walking over to the grave, and I hadn't quite got to it yet when all hell broke loose on the perimeter. The machine gun opened up firing, a couple loud explosions like grenades went off. I immediately turned around and ran back to where the radio was and to get my weapon, which I had left by the tree, and got down on the ground because there was bullets flying in all directions. And when I turned around, the two radio operators who would not touch the body were now in the grave, standing on the body, hiding in the grave because of the firefight that was going out on the perimeter. So that was one example of where the personal safety overcame their superstitions.
A need to evacuate the Montagnards to safer areas became apparent as enemy activity increased around their villages. A program was evolved for the resettlement and care of these people. In each move, the entire village was lifted bodily, huts, belongings and all, and transported to a more secure location. The men of the 4th Division helped to create a tight bond between the Montagnards and their country. Infantry swept through the steaming jungle near the Cambodian border, seeking to block North Vietnamese regiments who periodically dashed across the border in hopes of a quick victory. Often, small units of infantry would suddenly clash with overwhelming numbers of the enemy who pounced with swift ferocity. When the aircraft and the big guns were called in, the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, usually disengaged as quickly as they had appeared. In the autumn and winter of 1966, the North Vietnamese were often able to elude United States forces in pursuit. The U.S. hit the NVA from the air, but they were adept at camouflage and could only be flushed out of hiding from the ground. American and South Vietnamese ground forces embarked on a series of search and destroy missions to locate the North Vietnamese and to destroy them. The big mobile guns continued to do their share in dispersing the North Vietnamese. In operations like this and similar actions in early 1967, the powerful partnership of heavy mobile guns and infantry combined to pin down large North Vietnamese units and methodically assault them to make them ineffective. Operation Sam Houston grew out of an attempt by the Viet Cong to interrupt work on a vital road being built from Pleiku to a Special Forces camp near the Cambodian border. The road-building crew had been the target of numerous mortar attacks and the scene of violent firefights. Despite intelligence reports of a large mass of NVA units, elements of the 4th Division moved through difficult terrain to meet the elusive North Vietnamese. Few landing zones in the dense jungle, and areas had to be cleared before resupply ships could bring in supplies and take out the sick or injured. This was the only physical link with the outside. Choppers were called in for all types of assignments. Top priority went to combat assault missions. To spot North Vietnamese concentrations under the umbrella of dense jungle foliage, light observation helicopters were used. Once they located the North Vietnamese, the light spotters called for their big brothers, the heavily armed Huey gunships. These helicopters packed an impressive amount of firepower. The gunships struck quickly with uncanny accuracy and formidable power. Their presence on the scene was always welcomed by the ground troops below, who moved in quickly to exploit the aerial attack. For the NVA, these combined attacks were costly. They generally had heavy losses of men, installations, and equipment. While their buddies hacked and beat their way through the thick jungles of the north, the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Division, working with the South Vietnamese Army, was assigned to War Zone C along the southern waterways. In the winter of 1967, this task force spearheaded the action in Operation Cedar Falls. Positioned along the southern sector of the Saigon River, a mechanized battalion of infantry was charged with a twofold mission: to engage in clear and hold operations along the river and to block the escape route of fleeing Viet Cong. As so often happened in the course of their mission, infantry uncovered a rich cache of rice left behind by the VC, which was airlifted out for distribution to the South Vietnamese. Hard on the heels of Operation Cedar Falls came Operation Gadsden, in which a battalion of infantry fought together with elements of the 25th Division. On one of their many sweeps deep in the jungle near Cambodia, they succeeded in taking a division-sized Viet Cong complex. At first, the Americans had met heavy resistance, but on the second day they moved in and found that overnight the North Vietnamese had abandoned the area. The complex was there to be taken. At the same time, within the Tu Corps area, the 4th Division concentrated on expanding its area of influence. With determination and tenacity, they hit the North Vietnamese with tremendous firepower. Between contacts with the North Vietnamese, the existence of the 4th Division was characterized by long periods of watchful waiting, with time for relaxation and time to do the hard work that needed doing. Then, all at once, short but brutal pitched battles. And that was the pattern until in April of 1967, the 1st and 2nd Brigades moved into Operation Francis Marion while operating from bases nicknamed Jackson Hole and the Oasis. The objective was to screen and guard the strategic quarter west of Pleiku. Throughout the extensive operation, units of U.S. infantry had clashed with well-equipped North Vietnamese troops infiltrating into South Vietnam. U.S. forces and equipment were moved quickly into place to block North Vietnamese forces wherever they chose to cross the border. During the operation, massive artillery was employed. More than 400,000 rounds hit the North Vietnamese. This devastating firepower was a major factor in slowing the North Vietnamese offensive and in demoralizing the NVA forces. While the rest of the division enjoyed the success of Operation Francis Marion, the infantry of the 3rd Brigade swung into Operation Cook. Convinced that most of the villages and hamlets in the area were either Viet Cong or sympathetic to them, the 3rd Brigade undertook an intensive search operation. Countless tunnels and holes in the area turned up Viet Cong supplies and prisoners. But along with the spoils, the infantry had to pay a price for victory. In the fall of 1967, a North Vietnamese Army regiment moved into a valley in the Central Highlands from the sanctuary of the Cambodian mountains to threaten a special forces camp. An area sweep was undertaken. Contact was immediately established. NVA patrols were particularly active around roads, but around-the-clock operations effectively neutralized the threat. The American infantry succeeded in blocking the NVA thrust while simultaneously blocking thrusts to the south. At the same time, intelligence reported a heavy North Vietnamese buildup in the dusty, inhospitable valley near Dak To. Infantry quickly responded to the challenge, moving into the rugged mountains near the Cambodian and Laotian borders. True to their tradition of courage and daring, the infantrymen worked their way up North Vietnamese-held hills. With the airstrip at Dak To under constant attack by 122mm rockets, the infantry slugged it out with the surrounding Viet Cong and engaged in fights against a well-trained and entrenched North Vietnamese army. The final battle at Dak To occurred on the northern slopes of Hill 875. On Thanksgiving Day, in the 5th and final day of the assault, the Americans hit the hill continuously with airstrikes, artillery, and mortar rounds. Air Force strikes destroyed whatever cover the NVA might have used in defense of their position. Against great odds, the infantry assaulted Hill 875, cutting off a vital supply and withdrawal route. In doing so, the American fighting force again proved that they could win a major set-piece battle with a strong North Vietnamese army force. The support of units engaged in combat was vital to the success of the battle. The cry medic, shouted on the battlefield, threw into operation the most sophisticated medical network known to man in wartime. Within moments of the call, medics were on hand to treat and evacuate the injured. During the Battle of Dak To, the infantry fought against 5 North Vietnamese Army regiments. This involved 3 U.S. brigades, supported by 17 batteries of artillery, resulting in more than 1,600 of the North Vietnamese being killed in action. Throughout the rugged Central Highlands, the most significant battles were for the hilltops, since the force that controlled the hilltops controlled the valleys below. American infantry fought to seize the most strategic hilltops for fire bases. This meant several days of saturation airstrikes and artillery fire. After the infantry had forged its way to the top, a bunker-type perimeter defense was constructed, followed by a land-clearing operation. When completed, the hilltop was a barren, dusty knob protruding from the valley floor. But even then, the area was by no means secure and had to be defended against North Vietnamese assaults. Combat patrols were sent to seek out and ambush the North Vietnamese. Forward observers pinpointed North Vietnamese positions for artillery. While in the valley, pursuit of the NVA continued. Contributing to the victory at Dak To were the big tanks and tracked vehicles of the American armor. These rumbling giants brought new dimensions of firepower, mobility, and shock action to the ground fight. The Viet Cong ambush on a convoy was abruptly turned into a rout when tanks and armored personnel carriers moved into action. In short order, they had the North Vietnamese on the run. The month-long Battle of Dak To, part of Operation MacArthur, was the turning point for the American infantry in the Tu Corps area. They continued to fight the North Vietnamese wherever they found them. At Vinh Loc, harassment of the elusive North Vietnamese was almost a daily occurrence. Thanks to the short-range reconnaissance patrols and their supporting units, threat after threat was eliminated. The American infantryman was eminently successful in the Central Highlands. Within 2 years, their zone of influence increased tenfold, covering some 10,000 square miles of rugged terrain. Though the image we have of this war is one of helicopters and infantry air mobile assaults, there were other types of American forces utilized. The natural barriers and unfriendly terrain in Vietnam made it tough for modern machines of war, but surprisingly, American mechanized units surmounted these obstacles through ingenuity and sheer determination. The role of American tanks in Vietnam was not and is not a well-known story, but the role they played was instrumental to the success the Americans had in the field. A jungle might seem like a strange place for armored vehicles that can cover hundreds of miles per day in open country. Yet when the North Vietnamese could have been anywhere, armor meant a lot to the foot soldier. Armor helped the soldier beat a path. Armor meant firepower, that extra threat that kept the North Vietnamese from concentrating their forces. The armored cavalry in Vietnam meant mobility and speed, a prime requirement of modern warfare, even during the 1960s and 70s. They built a proud record of accomplishments while fulfilling their missions. Under unique battlefield conditions never before encountered by mechanized ground forces, they built a record of leadership, ingenuity, spirit, and valor that will always live in the annals of the armored cavalry. New ways to do old jobs had to be found, and these men were equal to the task. The Three Corps area contained the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, important cities such as Bien Hoa and the Rice Bowl provinces. It also included strategic areas such as the Elephant's Ear and the trackless jungles near the Cambodian border. As an independent force in this vital area, the 11th Armored Cavalry gave needed support to other U.S. and Allied forces. The familiar armored personnel carriers were beefed up for the counterinsurgency mission in Vietnam. Each vehicle was fitted with 2 additional machine guns and modification of armor that gave the men greater protection. The crew of 5 men included the vehicle commander, driver, grenadier, and 2 gunners. The result was the Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle, or ACAV, the key vehicle of the light armored platoons. After it had been proved in combat, the ACAV was rapidly deployed by other units throughout Vietnam. Heavier armor typified by the M48 tank provided each squadron with a big punch. The newest armored vehicle with the 11th was the Sheridan. It mounted a 152mm gun, which also launched a missile. Self-propelled artillery was also part of the squadrons and was assigned to individual units in whatever mix the commander required. Artillery support proved to be a valuable asset. At first, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment was equipped with self-propelled 105mm howitzers. Later, these were to be replaced by 155mm howitzers, which had greater range. The regiment became a completely mobile reconnaissance and striking force. They became the only freewheeling armored unit of its kind in combat in Vietnam. Within its squadrons were custom vehicles and special purpose weapons such as heavy mortars capable of devastating fire, and highly trained mobile scouts, including a Thunder Horse troop of air cavalry. Within 3 weeks of arrival, units of the 11th had met the North Vietnamese, beginning with a fight for the regiment's line of communication. The Viet Cong had plenty of warning as the long lines of armor rolled down the roads and into the northern sector of the Three Corps area. Friendly observers reported the North Vietnamese were rising to the bait, preparing ambushes. In Operation Atlanta, the men of the 11th routed the ambushers with overwhelming firepower, taking a heavy toll in North Vietnamese dead and captured. Many of the North Vietnamese weapons were seized on the battlefield. The people of this region were supportive of the armored units in the early days of the war. This initial success made the task easier. As the Black Horse Base Camp began to grow, its resupply and security gained importance. Headquarters became the hub of activity. Everywhere, the camp was developed into a comfortable main base, even though a large part remained under canvas. Communications were an important reason for the camp's existence. Powerful electronics equipment at the Tactical Operations Center allowed full communications with higher headquarters at Long Binh and with field units, which had mobile armored command posts. When in position, these field units were made secure against North Vietnamese night raids. Planned fire, concertina, and mines encircled the area. During daylight hours, these forward outposts were busy centers of planning and direction. In all, this communications network provided outstanding support for the troopers in the field. Fanning out from the base, armored convoys patrolled the area and protected vital supply lines as they kept the roads open. Often an armored patrol guarded an important junction or other strategic point. After long hours of patrolling far from their base, men and vehicles would pull off the road to rest. During these short periods of respite, the troopers never wandered very far from their vehicles. This was North Vietnamese country. For days at a time, they were on duty 24 hours a day. They could never drop their guard, and it made it difficult for the VC to disturb the peace. In January 1967, Operation Cedar Falls swept the Iron Triangle area northwest of Saigon, a long-time North Vietnamese hideout. The armored cavalry acted as a pushing force, beating the bushes for the North Vietnamese, driving them into a waiting blocking force composed of other U.S. and Allied forces. It was a tough, dangerous job, much of it in country where the American servicemen could not see the front of their vehicles from the driver's seat. Mile by mile, the armored cavalry helped force the VC out of their tunnels. They found piles of supplies, everything and anything which the North Vietnamese could use to carry out his attacks. No road was safe from VC booby traps. Here, a hole to trap vehicles is shown, with a path left for the North Vietnamese to use. The armored vehicles would just create a new path and move on. The operation was an unqualified success. Documents captured from the North Vietnamese attested to the hardships they suffered as the armored units closed in. Then came the Rice Bowl country. In this region, the men of the armored units helped keep the fields and the roads free so the crop would be safe from seizure by the Viet Cong. Also, the presence of armored units kept the peace and kept the North Vietnamese from intimidating the villagers. Bridges launched by armored vehicles were often laid down to keep traffic flowing. Flash flooding of small streams washed away the crude, locally built bridges, and buses were unable to make their scheduled destinations. The military bridges helped speed them on their way. The prime purpose of road and highway upkeep, however, was to keep the region open for the fluid movement of military convoys. In the Vol Dat region, this Scissors Bridge was a useful complement to the regiment's armored strength. It could be erected or removed quickly and without any construction work. In addition to aiding military vehicular traffic, these portable bridges open newer and shorter routes to nearby marketplaces for the villagers and farmers of the area. As the need presented itself, these scissor bridges were moved from one locale to another with ease and speed. In the province of Tay Ninh, along the Cambodian border in the country called the Elephant's Ear, armored units penetrated into terrain previously considered too rough for vehicles. In Operation Junction City, a sweep through War Zone C during July 1967 was accomplished by the armored units. Military convoys and the South Vietnamese people could use the roads in greater safety. From the air, it was now possible to spot any Viet Cong activity near these vital roadways. Tanks were used to keep the roads open at strategic points, firing to keep the North Vietnamese off balance. During the operation, command and control was maintained through the use of helicopters, making it easier for field commanders to visit various units. The Air Cavalry Troop of the regiment, known as Thunder Horse, had its own helicopter gunships and transports. Forward air controllers performed effective liaison between the Air Force and our armored units. By August 1967, the base camp was well established and offered the returning troopers many of the comforts of home. The return to action came all too soon, with the almost unbelievable complication of trying to fight a war in which both friends and enemies might be found in the same general area. Extreme accuracy was a must when firing heavy weapons. Special weapons like these 4.2-inch mortars mounted in carriers were used to provide additional fire support to the squadrons. But it wasn't all fighting. American servicemen worked closely with soldiers of the South Vietnamese Army to help train local cadre in self-defense. The maintenance and use of field communications equipment was one of the primary training courses. Other instruction included weapons such as the carbine. Drills for crew-served mortars soon familiarized the Allied soldiers with these weapons, and as they worked with them, the ARVN soldiers gained confidence. In the late fall of 1967, as the war continued and operations expanded, the safety of convoys became a continuing responsibility. A young security officer of the 3rd Squadron is shown here making sure his men understand their orders and special road instructions. Then the long haul over dirt roads began. North Vietnamese hijackers waiting to seize this valuable convoy of supplies called it off when they saw the armored units. The Medical Civilian Assistance Program was also guarded against surprise attacks by the armored units, while hundreds of people who had no other medical care were treated. Here, the doctors and medical staff were able to care for young and old alike without fear of being interrupted in their work. In Operation Santa Fe, the armored units worked with the Australians, who learned to use the American equipment. The Aussies handled the American armor like veterans. During Operation Santa Fe, the Aussies conducted a large sweeping operation, driving the North Vietnamese forces into the waiting trap set up by the waiting units of infantry. The operation went off with clock-like precision as the Australians pressed the North Vietnamese back. Armored flamethrowers were also used to clear the tree lines in suspected North Vietnamese positions. Then came the Vietnamese New Year, Tet. The North Vietnamese chose this occasion to unleash well-coordinated attacks in several areas of the Republic. Everywhere the Viet Cong were met with counterattacks. Striking treacherously where least expected, the Viet Cong brought the war to the cities of South Vietnam. Gunfire roared in the streets and panic spread throughout the population.
People were surprised by the ferocity of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese attacks against the cities of South Vietnam, and the famous pictures and all the things that came out of that offensive. But that's a battle where the Viet Cong rise up in rebellion and come out and fight American and South Vietnamese forces in the open, in the cities where they can be seen and hit by firepower. And again, you'll have this application of tremendous firepower on the part of American and Allied forces. And by the end of Tet, the Viet Cong will have ceased to exist as a combat force. And from that point on in the war, clearly the North Vietnamese Army is the only force that's really fighting in South Vietnam effectively. And so it's actually a great victory for America, but because of this surprise, because of the images, it'll have quite a different impact in the media and on the people of the United States.
The armored cavalry rose to the challenge and in a lightning-fast road march from the area near Cambodia, raced to the defense of the embattled cities. There, they supported the ARVN troops, cutting off North Vietnamese escape routes. The city of Bien Hoa was secured by the armored assault of the 3rd Squadron, in which the North Vietnamese were routed in house-to-house fighting. They were also sent to the defense of the capital, Saigon. Large areas of the capital's residential sections had been laid to waste by concentrated Viet Cong rocket attacks and mortar bombardments. The people who were displaced wandered aimlessly through the city. In the midst of all this, the fighting continued as military police patrolled the city. Day and night in the alleys and in the streets, the relentless hunt for the VC carried the armored cavalrymen into every nook and cranny of the capital. The Viet Cong were forced to give ground with appalling losses. The ARVN forces distinguished themselves during the Tet campaign, acting aggressively to free their cities. Wherever they went, they were solidly backed by armor, their own or often that of the 11th Armored Cavalry. A few days after the initial attacks, the ARVN began to retake and free the cities. Soon it became evident that communications had been secured. The bridges remained open, and once again, traffic began to flow. Armored vehicles were everywhere, providing security. This was the so-called Chinatown of Saigon. Here, after the first victories at Bien Hoa and Saigon, the armored units stayed in the thick of the fight. Troopers moved methodically from block to block, probing into every building along the way. Finally, it became apparent the Viet Cong had left the area, and there would be no more battles in the streets. When the Tet campaign was over, the back of the Viet Cong was broken, and fighting in the south was increasingly taken over by the North Vietnamese Army. For these men, this was the daily war, the no-headline war of nerve-wracking uncertainty, of constant plotting and searching where every footstep may lead to injury or death. In the open country, through the jungles, and in the cities, throughout the Three Corps area, or wherever they're needed, the men of the regiment fought on for freedom with the help of armored firepower. These young men grew up in a hurry. 18, 19, 20 years old. They were boys when they got here. They became men overnight. The suffering, hardships, and sorrow they bore helped to make them compassionate, tolerant, and mature. The young men who comprised the vast bulk of the infantry and armored units were seldom seen on television or rarely interviewed by the press, but they made their mark in the historic effort known as Vietnam. These men who fought and died in support of their country cannot and should not be forgotten. Even today, almost 30 years later, they can proudly lay claim to doing their part in a fight not of their making, in a war far, far away.